John chapter 11. We'll start in verse 1 and read through verse 16. John chapter 11. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you are going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. And the disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant by taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, or Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. All right, last week we were introduced to all the characters of this text, or most of them. Will be introduced to another one at the end of it. So we have the characters that have been set up. And the characters in John chapter 11, you have Lazarus and two sisters whose names are Mary and Martha. Okay, so you have Lazarus, and you have Mary, and you have Martha, and they were all connected in a particular way.
Bethany.
They were what? They were from Bethany, yes, but what was their relationship? They were brothers and sisters, okay? So they were living in the same house together, it seems. Now, that just kind of weirded me out when I thought about it for a second, because, I don't know about you, but I don't think I could have lived with my siblings in my adult life. How about you? Would that be fun, Ryan? Ryan?
It could be.
Ryan, would that be fun? I mean, seriously, think about it. Think about your siblings and think about living your adult life with your siblings. I mean, it was fun while it lasted, yeah, in my youth, but it was great to get out of the house, and get out on your own. I understand that, but you have Lazarus and Mary and Martha, and they seem to all be living in the same habitation. We don't know how old they were. What we do know is it seemed like Martha was, older, Lazarus was older, Mary was the one that was younger, so you have these siblings that are living together. Now, does that seem weird to anybody else when it comes to our culture? Well, for me, it's kind of weird.
Depends on how big the house is.
Well, I know, but if you, it is. I'll give you an example. When I was at Pleasant Valley, first place that I ever preached at, there was this old couple, and they were 76 years old when I went there. When I first got there, there was an older couple named Owen and Novella Hodges, and they had never married in their entire life, and they had lived together their entire life as brother and sister. Now, let me ask you a question. Is that weird for our culture? Yeah, it is. But they were the nicest people you can ever imagine. And my granddad told me stories about them because they would come up to the seed house and they would buy fertilizer and seed in New Providence, and they would always pay with cash. And my granddad loved it when they paid with cash. Because when they paid in cash, they would tip him because he would load it for them. My dad and my uncle would load it for them, and he would keep the tip. Now, I give it to my dad and my uncle if he keep the tip, because it's cash. So anyway, but you have Owen Lavelle, they're 78. They went to Pleasant Valley, and they lived together until they both basically died in the same year. Very interesting people, right? Not something that you see when it comes to this culture very often. But Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived in the same house. Now, that's 2,000 years removed from our culture, so it's something that they did a lot of back then because there were clans and families that stuck together when it came to that habitation and came to that place. We, in our Western culture, seem to fly the nest or go away and not live within proximity of those who are around us. Now, I know that this is kind of an area that's opposite of that. You go to big cities, and it's basically an individual on an island because people have moved in and disconnected from their families and things like that. But we get to the geographical tension of the text. All right, we talked about this last week. And that's the tension between where Lazarus is, and where was Lazarus at? What was the city, Rick? Bethany. And we are told what Bethany that is later on in the text, because it's Bethany that is near what city? Jerusalem. So you have Bethany that is near Jerusalem, and we talked about the proximity that Bethany is to the Mount of Olives, which is right outside Jerusalem. It was basically a stone's throw away. So you have Bethany that's right outside Jerusalem where Lazarus is, but where's Jesus? Well, Jesus was basically attacked by this crowd in the temple in the last part of chapter 10, and Jesus left Jerusalem and went across where? What river? The Jordan River, which is like 17 miles away. As far as the straightest line that you can connect between Jerusalem and the Jordan River is 17 miles away. We don't exactly know where Bethany on the other side of Jordan was. We do know that John the Baptist was baptizing in Bethany across the Jordan River. We looked at the map last week. But anyway, the closest crossing of the River Jordan from Jerusalem was 17 miles away. So, 17 miles away from Bethany, probably 20, maybe even more than that, from where Jesus is and where Lazarus is, all right? Jesus is across the Jordan. Lazarus is right outside of Jerusalem. So, there is a great distance between where Jesus is and where Lazarus is. So, the tension in the text comes when we find out that Lazarus is what? Sick, all right? And Jesus is a couple of days' journey away from where Lazarus is. So the question is, and the tension is, what is Jesus going to do? Because this is a family that Jesus cared about very greatly. The Bible says this in chapter 11, verse 5. Jesus loved Lazarus. Jesus loved Mary. Jesus loved Martha. And the message they send to Jesus across the Jordan has to do with that truth. Because the message was very simple, very clear. And what was the message they sent in verse 3? Lord, he whom you love is sick. So Jesus loved all the people in this family. Jesus loved Martha, loved Mary, and Jesus loved Lazarus. So the sisters, Mary and Martha, want Jesus to come back to Bethany, right outside Jerusalem, and save their brother. Once again, there's this tension in the text, because where is Jesus? He's on the other side of the Jordan, where John was baptizing, right? So there's this tension that's building. When this message reaches Jesus, he is not in the vicinity of Bethany in Jerusalem. When this message reaches Jesus on the other side of the Jordan, according to chapter 10, verse 40, he announces to his disciples that Lazarus was sick. Now remember, how long does it take to get a message 20 miles away? This is not the age of, put a stamp on it and you send it in the mail and it gets there like, same day service or something like that. This is not the age of text messages or cell phones. If someone is 20 miles away, how long do you think that message is going to take to get there? Well, however long it takes to walk or ride or get there when it comes to some form of slow transportation. So you have the sisters of Lazarus in Bethany outside Jerusalem sending a message to Jesus on the other side of the Jordan. Probably took about 2 days to get there. Now, the announcement is made to everyone that is there that Lazarus is sick. And Jesus then gives even more description to this in verse 4. He said, this illness of Lazarus does not lead to death. I want you to click and save that. He says to the apostles, to the disciples, this illness of Lazarus does not lead to death, but for the glory of God, and so the Son of God may be glorified through it. So if I'm one of the disciples and I'm on the other side of the Jordan and I'm with Jesus and there's this courier that comes with this message that Lazarus is sick, and Jesus says it is not a sickness or an illness unto death, what do you think Lazarus is going to do? He's going to pull through. He's going to be fine. If Jesus says this is not a sickness unto death, what do you think as an apostle, as a disciple who's following Jesus, what do you think is going to be the condition of Lazarus if Jesus says that? He's going to be fine. Lazarus is going to get better. So, Jesus had the ability to heal someone long distance. We went over this when it came to the centurion servant at Capernaum. Do you remember that? The centurion went to seek out Jesus from Capernaum. And what did Jesus do when it came to healing the centurion servant? Did he go to Capernaum? No. What did he do?
Healed his son.
He healed that guy's servant just by saying, your servant is healed. He wasn't in Capernaum. Jesus was nowhere near Capernaum. And Jesus says, your servant's healed. Go ahead. Go back home. Did Jesus have to be in Bethany to heal Lazarus? No. So if I'm the disciples, I'm thinking that Lazarus is fine. I'm thinking that he's great. And it makes sense for Jesus to do the long distance thing. Because what was the condition when they left Judea? What was the condition when they left Jerusalem? What were they trying to do to Jesus? They were trying to kill him. So it would make sense for Jesus to stay on the other side of the Jordan, away from the hostilities of Judea and Jerusalem, and just kind of long distance the healing from across the Jordan to Bethany, and not even set foot in Bethany. Jesus stays in the place beyond the Jordan River after he gets the message about Lazarus for another 2 days. Then he tells the disciples something that causes more tension. He tells the disciples after those 2 days, after he has been telling them, or after he's been told Lazarus is sick, and he says, this is not a sickness unto death, this is for the glory of God. He tells the disciples, let's go again to Judea. Now, what's the reaction of you as a disciple? You know that he left Judea because they were trying to kill him and stone him. And you know that there is danger waiting for him when he gets back into Judea, and especially the closer that you get to Jerusalem. And what city is really close to Jerusalem? Bethany. So the disciples, they know that when Jesus goes back to Bethany, there's a really good chance something bad's going to happen. So the disciples, when they hear, let's go back again into Judea, they immediately want to talk Jesus out of it. I mean, their eyes had to have gotten really big whenever Jesus says, let's go again to Judea. Because they fled Judea for a reason. They even said this reason out loud in verse 8. They explained to Jesus. Now, once again, it is showing the process of their faith, which we'll get to in a minute. They try to explain to Jesus the irrationality of his decision. You ever tried to talk to God about his irrationality? Does it go well? When it comes to God making decisions, do you think it goes well when you talk about it being irrational? That's what they're doing. They're saying that this is an irrational thing for you to do. And they even explain, the Jews were just seeking to stone you, and you want to go there again. Then there is added tension to the text. Who do you have waiting in Bethany? They haven't heard anything from Jesus for the last 4 days. 2 days for the message to get there. 2 days Jesus stayed in Bethany across the Jordan. Who is in Bethany waiting?
The sisters.
Mary and Martha, the sisters. They want Jesus to come back and heal their brother in Judea. Now you have the reason that Jesus is outside of Judea given to you, and that is that the Jews in Judea want to kill Jesus. Specifically the ones that were in Jerusalem that wanted to stone Jesus. And Bethany is really close to Jerusalem. You have this tension that's building up. The illness that Lazarus has is not unto death, so that means Lazarus is okay. Why are we having to go back to this place where they want to stone you? Why are we going back to this dangerous and threatening place? And Jesus explains to them in chapter 11, verse 11, and I can only imagine the confused look on the disciples' faces as Jesus explains, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. And I go to wake him. Now, we understand what's going on in this text when it comes to the wording that is being used. Jesus, by saying that Lazarus has fallen asleep, obviously in the text, because it explains it, is talking about Lazarus doing what? Dying. Lazarus has died. Now, when Jesus says that Lazarus has fallen asleep, the apostles don't get the message. They think that Jesus said Lazarus is taking a nap. He's tired, he's weary, he had a sickness, he's going to wake up. Why do we have to go to Judea? So the disciples think when Jesus says that Lazarus is asleep, that Jesus is going to wake him up from a resting sleep. And Jesus wants to go back into enemy territory where Lazarus is asleep. That seems very confusing. What's going on? So Jesus, knowing their confusion, tells them very plainly and clearly, Lazarus is dead. Now, if you're the disciples, what are you thinking right now? What did Jesus just say? 2 days before this, hadn't said anything about it since. What did he say? Jesus said when he got that message about Lazarus, don't worry, this sickness is not unto what? This sickness is not unto death. And now 2 days later, Jesus says, well, Lazarus is dead. What's your face look like? What are you talking about? But Jesus didn't just say this would not end in death. What did he say? This is for the glory of God and for the glory of the Son. Lazarus has died. The other thing is this, if you didn't catch it, how did Jesus know that Lazarus was dead? There was no courier. There was no message that was sent. The first time, 2 days before, Martha and Mary sent a courier to him saying, the one whom you love is sick. Jesus simply says to the apostles, Lazarus is now dead. Wonder how he knew that. Jesus is on the other side of the Jordan. Bethany is 20 miles away, and he knows exactly when Lazarus dies without even being there. Now, if I knew someone was sick, and I'm talking to you in a conversation, and I stop that conversation and I say, well, you know what it's talking about? They just died. How do you know? Who told you? Jesus knew exactly what was going on in Bethany with Lazarus when it came to his health and when it came to everything that was going on. But you also begin to understand the disciples are growing when it comes to their faith. They're maturing when it comes to their faith. Because when Jesus speaks the words that Lazarus is dead, this has been 2 days later since the first message, and he says, Lazarus is dead. The disciples don't question it. Not even Peter pops up. You would think Peter would pop up in this conversation at some point in time, but he doesn't. And if Lazarus is dead, then Lazarus is dead. That's what Jesus said. And I hope you come to that point when it comes to your faith, that whatever Jesus says about anything and everything is absolutely true. So when Jesus says Lazarus has died, they knew that Lazarus was dead. And Jesus tells the apostles, for your sake. Now this is where it gets fun. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. Did you get the whole point of this? Lazarus died. And Jesus did not go back for their sake. What is so important in the near future of the disciples when it comes to their faith that they know that Jesus has power over? What's going to happen within a few days?
Death.
The death of Jesus on the cross. And Jesus says, for your sake, I am glad I was not there. So that you may believe. There's this interesting commentary by Johann Bengel that brought up a point I've never thought about when it comes to this. And he said, in all of my studies, I've never found where anyone died in the presence of the Prince of Life. Now you can tell that was a commentary that was written a long time ago. There is never a time where someone died when the Prince of Life was present. And I got to thinking, that's true. Now, yeah, there were dead people that Jesus came to and raised from the dead. But there's no one who died in the presence of the Prince of Life. And he talks about how there's nowhere in all the accounts. He goes through and lists all these times where you think that someone was dying or going to die in the presence of Jesus, and they did not. No one took their last breath in his presence. No one passed away in the presence of Jesus. There was no record of a death being present when Jesus was present. And Bengel made this comment that I never thought about. If you suppose that death could not survive the presence of the Son of God, then the absence of Jesus from the scene of Lazarus is explained beautifully. Lazarus would not have died. Jesus stays away for 2 more days, and we ask the question, why? Lazarus had to die. And the explanation that Martha gives carries even more weight when you think about it like this, because what is Martha's explanation when Jesus shows up? Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It kind of sent chills when I was reading that. I've never thought about it like that before. And Jesus explains to the apostles, for your sake I'm glad that I was not there with Lazarus, so that you might believe. So the purpose of the delay was so Jesus could grow their faith and mature their faith and to help them believe to an even greater degree. Because belief, the word believe in John chapter 11 is one of the most used words in the entirety of the chapter. It is used in verse 15, it's used in verse 25, verse 26, verse 27, verse 40, verse 42, verse 45, verse 48. 8 times in this chapter alone, we are talking about belief. So the faith of the disciples is going to be tested in a massive way over the next few weeks. Jesus is going to die on a cross and to help them with their faith when it comes to the resurrection and to help them with their faith when it comes to the power that Jesus has over death. Jesus was going to show them the power of the glory of God in the resurrection of Lazarus. Now, how great of a tool is that to see the power that Jesus has over the grave before he ever gets to the cross? You understand why Jesus says, I am glad for your sake that I was not there, so that you might believe. The faith in this text is developmental. The disciples had followed Jesus for 3 years. They had seen Jesus do some very amazing things, and they had heard Jesus teach and speak as no one has ever spoken before. Yet the disciples were constantly under this spiritual growth process, all right? They were constantly within these spiritual growth pains where you would think, yes, they are on the right path, and then they do something absolutely moronic. They believed that Jesus was who he said he was way back in the first miracle that we went over. Remember the first miracle that Jesus did? What was the first miracle? Water and wine, John chapter 2. You know what it says in John 2 and verse 11? The disciples believed in him. Let me ask you a question. Back in chapter 2, do you think that's the same belief as when Lazarus was raised from the dead? Or do they need a little help getting there? They need a little help getting there. Now, there's another tension revealed in this text in the first paragraph. The first paragraph from verse 1 through 16. And that is what Thomas says to the rest of the group. And this is where it really gets fun for me. Thomas is with the rest of the group when Jesus tells them, we are going back to Judea. And you remember the danger that's in Judea, that Jesus just left the temple because they were trying to stone him and trying to kill him. And Jesus just says, let's go back to Judea, back to hostile territory where the Jews wanted to stone Jesus. And if they're going to kill Jesus, who are they going to turn their eyes on next? His followers, which is what happened after Jesus died. So Thomas, I want you to get this. We're going to talk about the invitation too. Thomas gathers the rest of the disciples. This is that Thomas, by the way. Thomas gathers the rest of the disciples. And what does he say to all the rest of the disciples? When Jesus says we're going back to Judea and back into the danger and back into the threat, and we are going to put our lives in danger by going back into Judea, what does Thomas say? Let's go back and we'll die with him. Let me ask you a question. Most of us have only one thing that we remember about Thomas. What's the one thing we remember about Thomas? What do we call him? Doubting Thomas. I want you to look at what Thomas said. Thomas knows what they're getting into. He knows the danger and the threats that are waiting for them outside Jerusalem, and he has seen people try to kill the person that he is following. And all the rest of the apostles and the disciples are having this conversation. What in the world are we going to do? And Thomas rallies them together and says, let us go and die with them. Now, is that the Thomas you remember? Or do you remember the other thing? The text reveals something very interesting that will come into play in our study of Revelation this Sunday afternoon as well. For those of you who have a different translation, the ESV says Thomas, who is also called the twin. Some of you have the translation of that in Greek. What does that mean? It starts with a D. Didymus. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is, Thomas is the Hebrew name of Thomas. And we're going to get into this, 1:30 service on Sunday. Thomas is the Hebrew name that he had. Didymus is the Greek name that he was known by. So you have the Hebrew name, Thomas, and you have the Greek name, Didymus. Basically, all Jews had two names. Give me another one that you know very well. Simon Peter. Now, from our culture looking back, what do we look at that like? Well, there's two names, so that's his first name and his last name. and some people do that when it comes to Jesus, too. You have Jesus, Christ. But you have two names when it comes to being a Jew. You have your Hebrew name, which is then followed by your Greek name. Your Hebrew name is what your Hebrew people knew you by. Now, who are the Hebrew people in this particular scenario? The Jews, right? They knew you by your Hebrew name. Now, your Greek name had a wider and a broader population in which they recognized you. So you had Thomas, who was a Hebrew name and known by his Hebrew people when it comes to Thomas. And then you had Didymus, which is known by the entire Greek population as a Greek name. The other thing about Thomas is that Thomas gets a really bad rap. What he says after the resurrection in John chapter 20 and verse 24, when he doubts the resurrection, the other thing, and I don't want to get too far into this, but the other thing is Thomas was not even there in the upper room. We don't know where he was. We don't know if he was out sulking or, he was just devastated and he wasn't with the apostles. He wasn't even in the upper room. At the time that Jesus came, he was gone. And someone came to him. Someone went to him and said, Jesus is raised from the dead. And he said, I will not believe unless I touch the scars in his hands, or where the nails pierced his hands and his side. But before that famous scene that we all attach to him, this is Thomas. This is the dedication of Thomas. This is the loyalty of Thomas. This is the intensity of the faith of Thomas. Jesus is going back to a very dangerous situation outside of Jerusalem where people were going to try to kill him. And Thomas rallies the rest of them and says, let's go die with Jesus. The apostles, they basically look at this as a suicide mission. They try to talk Jesus out of it. And the implication in verse 16 is the disciples were sitting there discussing this, discussing staying there instead of going with Jesus. And Thomas gets them together and says, let's go with him and die. It speaks to the loyalty of Thomas had to Jesus in a very public and very definitive way. So going back over this text and getting ready for the text next week, I'm sorry we didn't get to the resurrection. That's going to be a fun discussion next time. We see the tensions that are building in this text before we ever get to the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus isn't even back to Bethany yet. Now, when he gets back to Bethany, what's the tension going to be when he gets there? You got the two sisters that sent the message, and Lazarus is dead. And they blame Jesus for not being there. You have Jesus 20 miles away across the Jordan River, and Jesus waits for another 2 days before he even sets foot into Judea. And the disciples were told that the illness that Lazarus had would not lead to death. And then Jesus tells them 2 days later, Lazarus is dead. And Jesus explains the tension of this by saying, for your sake I was glad I was not there, so that you may believe. And the disciples have to be the most perplexed people on this trip ever. How is this going to be to the glory of God? Lazarus is dead. They're walking back into this threatening, dangerous situation in Jerusalem or outside Jerusalem. How in the world is this going to be the glory of God? And it all reveals itself. So, the tension that this sets up in the next scene is traveling over the Jordan, back into the territory of Judea, arriving in Bethany, outside Jerusalem, in chapter 11, verse 17, and meeting the sisters face to face after Lazarus has died. So we'll talk about the resurrection of Lazarus next week, but I just want to open it up. What lessons did you learn as you went through this Word of God in John chapter 11? Maybe that you didn't learn before, didn't know before. Maybe that pop out that you haven't read in a while. What lessons did you learn?
I didn't know about the Greek and Hebrew names.
It's very, very interesting. And John brings that out in Revelation. And it is, yeah. Because we're going to be talking about Abaddon, which is the Hebrew word for destroyer, and Apollyon, which is the Greek word for destroyer. And it's very interesting because if you are talking about someone with a Hebrew name and with a Greek name, what's your audience? What was the audience of John? What was the audience? The people who had a Hebrew name and a Greek name. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Why was he called the twin?
That was a good question, and I got nowhere on that one. There's a lot of people going, we don't know where the twin was, or if he was a twin, or if it had something to do with family. They don't know. So maybe he was a twin. That's what a lot of people will say, but they just don't know. He was a twin of someone, but they don't know who, and never mentioned.
Was he the apostle that was sawn in two?
Huh?
Was he Thomas the apostle that was sawn in two?
I don't think so.
One of them were, and I was thinking it was Thomas.
That was, oh man. Now you got me piquing my interest.
Well, I'm probably wrong, so don't worry.
No, I was just reading that he was, and this is historical, but that he was the man, or the missionary, if you will, to parts of India, and then he died there.
Says he was killed with a spear.
A spear.
Isaiah, that was who you're thinking about. Isaiah the prophet was supposedly sawn in two.
I thought one of the apostles was.
And that, I remember that now because we were talking about the prophets, or maybe we were going through Isaiah, and there is something that alludes to him being like his death. Kind of like Peter, when Jesus says to Peter that you will be led to a place you don't want to go. You know, and by this he symbolized what death he was going to die. So. But no, as far as history goes, I think Thomas was that missionary to, I can't think of the map. Anyway.
I just had the vision a little different,
What was that?
the interpretation when Jesus said, well, you know, we're going to go back to Judea, and I can imagine what the conversation was like, or what the situation was like. The disciples are going, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
You know, you're wanting to go back. Those people just decided that they're, you know, you just fled from death 2 different times just recently.
Mhm.
And these people are going to kill you. And then Thomas says, we've been everywhere else with you. Let's go in now.
That's right.
That
That's
was
right.
kind of the way I envisioned
Well,
it. You know, instead of
it's hard.
the fear and hesitation, there really was the hesitation and fear of death. But Thomas said, look, okay, here we go.
And I was reading this commentary that said it is hard to define pessimism within the conversations of the Bible, but Thomas seems to, what did he say? Thomas seems to draw on that when it comes to this. Because he said, you know, they were going back to Judea, he said, let's just go die. You know? So,
That's the way I envisioned it.
yeah.
That's probably not true.
But I mean, he was the guy that I was reading was the same way. He was like, I have to believe that Thomas was a pessimist. That's what he said. So he saw the dark in the situation before he saw the light. And that he kind of connected that to the upper room because Thomas was the only one who was not there when the rest of the apostles were. We don't know where Thomas was. So it's kind of like he was, you know, down and he was just gone. Like, Jesus is dead, there's nothing else to do. So.
There we see that. It says, Thomas encouraged them, let us go also go.
Mhm.
As a partnership, also go. That they may die with him. I think he was in positive they were going to die, and one of the other apostles, and it's applause for the reason.
Yeah, well, he definitely displayed that. Whether it's negative leadership or positive, he displayed leadership when it came to that.
You know, the other thing too about them complaining basically because he didn't come sooner.
Yep.
Well, that's the way we are. You know, we want an answer right then, but it's not, you know, there's a reason why, you know, that we don't get our answer when we want it. And same reason, so.
I just can't. And this is what drove me nuts thinking about this. I cannot think of how hard it would be to walk to Bethany knowing that Lazarus was dead, knowing what Jesus said about Lazarus, that this was not unto death, or wasn't going to end in death, and not knowing what Jesus was going to do until he got there. Because Lazarus wasn't raised on the way there. So you have this journey they're taking from the River Jordan all the way to Bethany, and they have no clue as to what's going to happen.
You think they walked 20 miles and didn't talk?
Oh, yeah. Well, it depends on Thomas. If he was the pessimist, he probably, no, he didn't want to talk about nothing. They were going to die. But anyway, I don't know if he's a pessimist or not, but what I do know is they had no clue how this was going to be for the glory of God because Lazarus was dead. So can you imagine all the stuff that's going through your head as to how is this going to work out? And then getting there, and here's the big thing that happens next week. They get there, and everyone is bawling their eyes out. How is this going to work? So that's where the tension comes again, you know. So it's just a great example of how the Bible, I mean, just floors you with all the details that we just kind of skim over, and just sets you up for the next great thing that Jesus does in order to produce faith in those that are following him.
And he hadn't just died. It wasn't like Jesus could fix it because it wasn't long ago. He had died been dead long enough, his body was
Oh, yeah.
decaying.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, his body now stinks. All right, we'll talk about resurrection next week. I'm sure that'll be a very stimulating conversation. So, looking forward.